The metal doors sealed with a hollow clang, hiding the fire completely from view, and Axel Bergstrom stepped back from the stone structure that had consumed 4 months of his life. Outside, 3 trappers stood in the snow, watching through the cabin window as the madman who had spent an entire summer gathering rocks prepared to prove that invisible fire could keep a man alive through a Rocky Mountain winter. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of forgotten frontier ingenuity move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale reveals an innovation even more unbelievable than this one. The year was 1834. The Rocky Mountain fur trade was at its height, and fortunes were being made by men willing to risk everything for beaver pelts that commanded premium prices in eastern markets. Trappers spread throughout the mountain territories, working tributaries and streams from Montana to Colorado, living in rough cabins and enduring conditions that killed the unprepared with brutal efficiency. Winter was the greatest threat. Cold that could freeze exposed skin in minutes, snowstorms that buried entire valleys, and the constant challenge of maintaining fire in conditions where failure meant death. Axel Bergstrom had survived 6 winters in these mountains. He was Swedish by birth, having come to America at age 19 seeking the freedom and profit that the fur trade promised. He was 31 years old now, competent with traps and rifles, careful in his methods, and experienced enough to respect the dangers that surrounded him. He worked the streams feeding the Yellowstone River in what would later become southwestern Montana, territory that offered excellent trapping and relative isolation from the conflicts between various tribes and the encroaching American presence. That spring, Axel had partnered with Matthias Keller, a Swiss-Germanic trapper, who had come west 5 years earlier. They had established a camp near the confluence of 2 creeks, building a single-room cabin using standard methods. The structure took them 4 days to construct. Logs notched at the corners, moss and mud chinked between gaps, a single door, 1 small window covered with oiled cloth, and a simple stone fireplace built against 1 wall with an open hearth. It was adequate shelter, no different from dozens of similar cabins scattered throughout the region. Their fireplace was typical of frontier construction. Field stones stacked without mortar formed the back and sides. The hearth opened directly into the room, providing heat and a cooking surface. Smoke rose through a crude chimney made from stacked stones that extended above the roofline. The system worked adequately in moderate weather. During severe cold, the open design meant most heat escaped up the chimney, but that was simply accepted as the nature of fire. You kept the fire burning, you stayed warm. If the fire went out, you rebuilt it. That was mountain life. On April 23, 1834, an unseasonable cold front moved through their territory. Spring had seemed established, with daytime temperatures rising above freezing and snow melting from south-facing slopes. But mountain weather was unpredictable. The temperature dropped 30 degrees overnight. By dawn, fresh snow was falling, and the wind carried the bitter edge of deep winter, returning without warning. The storm intensified throughout the morning, transforming what should have been a mild spring day into conditions that rivaled the worst of January. Axel and Matthias had experienced late-season storms before, but this one carried a particular ferocity that suggested it would persist for days rather than hours. Matthias left the cabin at first light to check their trap lines along the eastern creek. The traps had been productive that week, and neither man wanted to lose catches to scavengers or damage from freezing water. Axel stayed behind to maintain the fire and process pelts from the previous day's collection. The work was tedious but necessary. Pelts had to be scraped, stretched, and dried properly, or they would lose value at trading posts. Around midday, the wind increased. Snow fell heavier. Axel kept the fire built up, feeding it regularly with split wood from their supply stacked against the exterior wall. The open hearth consumed wood quickly in cold weather, but they had prepared adequately. He worked through the afternoon, expecting Matthias to return by late afternoon as usual. The trap lines were only 3 miles distant, an easy walk under normal conditions. Darkness came early under heavy clouds. Matthias had not returned. Axel stood in the doorway, looking out into blowing snow, seeing nothing. He considered the possibilities. Matthias might have taken shelter, waiting out the worst of the storm. He might have injured himself and be struggling back slowly, or something worse might have happened. After another hour of waiting, Axel gathered his rifle, extra powder, and a blanket. He left the cabin and headed toward the trap lines. The wind cut through his layers of wool and leather. Snow had already covered Matthias's tracks from the morning. Axel followed the familiar route toward the eastern creek, calling out periodically, hearing nothing but wind in the pines. He found Matthias 2 miles from the cabin, lying in a hollow between 2 fallen logs where he had apparently tried to take shelter. Matthias was dead. His body was frozen, his face peaceful in a way that suggested he had simply stopped moving and let the cold take him. There were no signs of injury, no evidence of animal attack. He had simply been caught in the storm, unable to reach shelter, and had succumbed to hypothermia. Axel knelt beside his partner's body, understanding immediately what had happened. Their cabin fire had gone out during the previous night while both men slept. They had awakened to a cold cabin and had rebuilt. The fire, but the temperature inside had dropped significantly. Matthias had left that morning already chilled, had spent hours in worsening weather, and when he tried to return, he was too cold to make it. Axel wrapped Matthias in the blanket and dragged the body back to camp. The journey took 3 hours. He was exhausted when he finally reached the cabin. The fire inside had burned down to coals. He rebuilt it, brought Matthias inside, and spent the night sitting awake, unable to process what had happened. His partner was dead because their fire was unreliable. That single fact consumed his thoughts. Fire that went out meant death. Fire that demanded constant attention meant vulnerability. Something fundamental needed to change. Axel buried Matthias the next morning on a hillside overlooking the creek where they had trapped together. He marked the grave with stones and stood in the cold, trying to make sense of what had happened. His partner was dead, not from a bear attack, not from hostile encounter, not from accident with a rifle or trap, but from cold. Simple, preventable cold. The cabin had been less than 2 miles away. If Matthias had been warmer when he started back, if the cabin itself had retained heat better, if the fire had been more reliable, he would still be alive. That night, Axel sat in the cabin and stared at the open hearth. He fed it wood every hour, watching flames consume fuel and send heat straight up the chimney. He could feel the warmth on his face when he sat close. But 3 feet back, the temperature dropped noticeably. The cabin walls held some heat, but not much. By morning, if he let the fire burn down, the interior would be barely warmer than outside. This was accepted reality. This was how everyone lived. But Matthias was dead, and Axel could not accept it anymore. He became obsessed with understanding fire and heat. Over the next 2 weeks, as he continued trapping alone to finish the season, he paid attention to details he had always ignored. He noticed how much wood his fire consumed compared to the heat it produced. He observed that wind direction affected how well the fire drew. He saw that stone near the fire became warm, but that warmth dissipated quickly once the fire died down. He visited 2 other trapper camps within a day's travel, ostensibly for company, but actually to study their fireplaces. Every cabin had the same basic design: open hearth, stone or mud chimney, constant feeding required. Some were built better than others, with tighter log fitting or more substantial chimneys. But the fundamental problem remained universal. Fire demanded attention. Leave it unattended for 4 hours, and it would die. Let it die in severe weather, and you risked everything. The more Axel observed, the more convinced he became that there had to be a better way. He began thinking about the problem systematically. Fire produced heat. That heat mostly escaped. What if it could be captured? Stone absorbed heat when placed near fire. What if more stone was used, surrounding the fire completely? But fire needed air. Sealing it completely would suffocate it. So there had to be controlled airflow, not open exposure. His thoughts kept returning to one concept that seemed both logical and impossible. What if fire could be enclosed in a chamber, fed through a small opening, and sealed when not being tended? Would it suffocate? Would it burn hotter? Would the surrounding stone hold heat longer? He had no formal education in engineering or physics. He understood carpentry basics from his father in Sweden, but nothing about advanced construction or thermodynamics. What he did have was practical experience, careful observation, and a driving need to solve the problem that had killed his partner. By late May, when he prepared to leave the mountains for his annual supply run, Axel had made a decision. He would find answers, learn whatever he needed to learn, and return to build something better. Axel left the mountains in early June 1834 with his season's pelts loaded on 2 pack horses. The journey to the nearest trading post took 5 days. He sold his furs for a respectable profit, enough to sustain him through the next year with surplus for supplies. But instead of purchasing the standard trapper kit of powder, lead, coffee, salt, and tobacco, Axel spent only half his money on essentials. The rest he reserved for something different. He continued to St. Louis, arriving in late June. The city was growing rapidly, serving as the gateway to western expansion. Axel had visited before, but had never paid much attention to the buildings or how they were constructed. This time, he observed everything with focused intensity. He spent days walking streets, studying structures, asking questions that made people think he was peculiar. He found a bakery run by a German immigrant family and spent an entire afternoon watching them work. Their oven was built from brick, a large domed chamber with a small front opening and a metal door. They loaded it with wood, burned the fire until the brick was thoroughly heated, then raked out the coals and placed bread directly on the hot brick floor. The door sealed the chamber. Hours later, they opened it to find perfectly baked loaves. The brick had held enough heat to cook dozens of loaves without any visible fire. Axel asked how long the oven stayed hot. The baker said it remained warm enough to bake for 6 to 8 hours after the fire was removed. He visited homes of German and Scandinavian immigrants who had built masonry stoves, tall ceramic or stone structures that burned wood in enclosed chambers. They explained that these stoves, common in Europe, used far less wood than American fireplaces while providing more heat. The secret was thermal mass. Heavy stone or brick absorbed heat and released it slowly over many hours. One firing in the morning could keep a house warm all day and into the evening. Axel watched. Blacksmiths working with forges, noting how they controlled airflow to regulate fire temperature. Too much air and the fire burned too fast. Restricted air with proper draft created intense, sustained heat. He saw how metal could withstand high temperatures, how iron hinges and doors could seal openings while remaining functional through countless heating and cooling cycles. By mid-July, Axel had formed a complete vision of what he needed to build. A stone structure with thick walls surrounding a fire chamber. A small front opening fitted with metal doors that could seal completely. A chimney designed to provide draft even when doors were closed. The concept was clear in his mind, but he needed hardware he could not make himself. He found a blacksmith named Ezekiel Abernathy who operated a shop near the riverfront. Axel described what he wanted: a set of metal doors, hinged, fitted into a frame that could be mounted into stone. The doors needed to be thick enough to withstand intense heat, hinged to open and close repeatedly, and fitted tightly enough to seal effectively. Ezekiel listened with growing skepticism. When Axel finished, the blacksmith shook his head. "You are going to seal fire inside a stone box? The fire will suffocate. You will fill your cabin with smoke." Axel explained about draft and controlled combustion. Ezekiel remained doubtful, but agreed to forge the hardware. The work would take 2 weeks and cost more than Axel had planned, but he paid the deposit. Axel returned to the mountains in late July 1834 with unusual cargo. The metal doors and frame weighed nearly 40 pounds. The hinges were heavy iron, designed to support substantial weight and withstand repeated heating. He also carried a specialized trowel for working mortar, several small iron pins for reinforcement, and detailed sketches he had made of the masonry stoves and ovens he had studied. Other trappers he encountered on the trail looked at his supplies with confusion. Metal hardware was expensive and heavy. Most men spent their money on practical goods that directly supported trapping. Axel offered no explanations. He returned to the site where Matthias was buried, but chose a different location for his new cabin. The spot he selected was 50 yards from the creek on elevated ground with clear sight lines in all directions. Most trappers built close to water for convenience. Axel prioritized visibility and drainage. If threats approached, he wanted warning. If heavy rain came, he wanted to be above potential flooding. The location meant hauling water uphill daily. But the advantages outweighed the inconvenience. Before cutting a single log for the cabin walls, Axel began gathering stones. He spent 3 full weeks collecting material from the creek bed and surrounding hillsides. He was not looking for just any stones. He needed rocks that would withstand repeated heating and cooling without cracking. He tested candidates by building a fire and placing stones directly in the flames overnight. Shale cracked and split. Soft sandstone sometimes fractured, but harder granite and dense limestone remained intact. He rejected 2 stones for every one he kept. He also paid attention to shape. Completely irregular stones would be nearly impossible to stack into stable walls. He looked for rocks with at least one relatively flat face, even if the rest was rough and uneven. Each stone he selected was carried back to his building site and sorted by approximate size. Large foundation stones in one pile, medium wall stones in another, smaller gap-filling stones in a third. By mid-August, he had accumulated several tons of material. Other trappers occasionally passed by and saw his growing pile of rocks. Some asked what he was building. Axel explained he was constructing a fireplace that would hold heat longer and use less wood. Most nodded politely and moved on, clearly thinking his effort was excessive. A few were more direct in their skepticism. One trapper named Fergus O'Malley stopped for a night and watched Axel carefully fitting stones together to test combinations. 4 days to build a cabin, Axel, Fergus said, gesturing at the rock piles. You have been at this how long now? 5 weeks? Axel acknowledged it had been longer than standard construction. Fergus laughed, not unkindly but with genuine bewilderment. Winter will come before you finish gathering rocks, much less building anything with them. A fireplace is a fireplace. Stack some stones, build your fire, done. Axel did not argue. He simply continued fitting stones, testing how irregular shapes could interlock to create stability. Fergus left the next morning, still shaking his head at the madness of a man who thought rocks required such careful selection. Construction began in earnest in late August 1834. Axel started with a foundation trench, something most mountain cabins completely lacked. He dug 6 inches deep around the perimeter where his heat box would stand, then filled the trench with his largest, flattest stones set tightly together. This foundation would prevent settling and provide a level base for the walls above. The work was tedious. Each stone required positioning, adjusting, repositioning, until it sat firmly without rocking. 3 days of work produced a foundation barely visible above ground level, but it was solid. The walls rose slowly. Axel began each morning by mixing mortar, a combination of clay dug from the creek bank, horsehair obtained from his pack animals, and fine ash from his cooking fire. He had learned in St. Louis that horsehair reinforced clay, preventing cracking as it dried. The ash provided additional binding and reduced shrinkage. He mixed batches small enough to use within a few hours before the material became too stiff to work. Each stone was placed individually. He would select a candidate from his sorted piles, test fit it into the growing wall, remove it, apply mortar to the contact surfaces, then reset it firmly. The irregular shapes meant no two stones fit together the same way. Some required extensive mortar to fill gaps. Others nested together almost perfectly with minimal filling. The process demanded constant judgment about which stone to use in which location. Large, flat stones provided stability. Smaller, irregular pieces filled voids. Each course had to be relatively level before starting the next, which sometimes meant using multiple small stones to achieve the right height. Progress was painfully slow. A good day yielded 4 horizontal courses rising perhaps 10 inches. Bad days, when nothing seemed to fit properly, produced half that. Axel worked alone, talking to no one, focused entirely on the methodical process of transforming a pile of irregular rocks into a structured wall. By early September, the walls had reached 3 feet high, and the internal chamber was taking shape. Fergus O'Malley returned in mid-September, traveling through the area on his way to different trapping grounds. He found Axel still working on the stone structure, which now stood 4 feet tall with walls 2 feet thick. The interior chamber was roughly 3 feet wide, 3 feet deep, and open at the top. Fergus examined the construction with undisguised amazement at the effort involved. "You have been building this for 2 months," Fergus said, running his hand over the fitted stones. 2 months, Axel. I could have built 3 cabins in that time." Axel nodded, continuing to work mortar into gaps around a freshly placed stone. Fergus watched for a while longer, then asked the obvious question. "Why? What makes this worth 2 months of your life?" Axel explained his plan. The thick stone walls would absorb heat. The enclosed chamber would trap that heat instead of letting it escape up a chimney. The metal doors he had brought from St. Louis would seal the chamber, allowing fire to burn slowly with controlled airflow. One firing could potentially heat the stone mass enough to radiate warmth for many hours, perhaps through an entire night. Fergus listened to Axel's explanation with growing skepticism. "You are going to seal fire inside the stone box?" he asked, pointing at the growing structure. "Fire needs air, Axel. Everyone knows this. Seal it up, and you will suffocate it. You will have smoke pouring into your cabin with no way to escape." Axel tried to explain about controlled draft, about how the chimney would continue drawing air even with doors mostly closed, about how forges and ovens worked on similar principles. Fergus was unconvinced. "This is madness," Fergus said, though his tone carried more concern than mockery. "Hidden fire? Fire you cannot see burning? That is not how fire works. Fire burns in the open, where you can watch it, feed it, control it. What you are describing sounds like witchcraft, not carpentry." He gestured at the metal doorframe sitting nearby, already fitted with its heavy hinges. "You spent good money on that hardware, money that could have bought a winter's worth of supplies. And for what? To hide your fire behind metal doors?" Axel did not argue further. He had learned that explaining theoretical concepts to practical men was futile. The proof would come from the finished structure, not from words. Fergus left the next morning, still shaking his head, convinced that his friend had become obsessed with an idea that would ultimately fail. Axel returned to work as soon as Fergus disappeared down the trail. By late September, the walls reached 5 feet in height, and the structure was beginning to resemble its intended purpose. The interior chamber was now clearly defined, a rectangular space approximately 3 feet wide, 3 feet deep, and 4 feet tall. The walls surrounding it were 2 feet thick at the base, tapering slightly to 18 inches at the top. The total stone mass was substantial, weighing several tons. Every stone had been carried to the site, tested for heat resistance, fitted carefully into position, and secured with mortar. Axel began working on the front opening where the metal door frame would mount. This was the most critical junction in the entire design. The frame had to be set perfectly into the stone walls, creating a tight seal while remaining permanently secure. He selected his flattest stones for the areas immediately surrounding the frame. He mortised recesses into the stonework where the frame's edges would sit, creating mechanical interlocking rather than relying solely on mortar adhesion. He used his iron pins, driving them through pre-drilled holes in the frame and into the surrounding stone, creating connections that could not be pulled apart. The door frame installation took 5 full days. When finished, the heavy metal doors swung smoothly on their hinges and closed with a satisfying solidity. The fit was tight, but not binding. A small gap remained around the edges, intentional clearance that would allow minimal airflow even when the doors were fully closed. Axel tested the closure repeatedly, satisfied that the mechanism would withstand countless heating cycles without warping or failing. The most difficult technical challenge was complete. The chimney construction occupied the first 3 weeks of October. Axel built it directly above the fire chamber, using progressively smaller stones as the structure rose. The interior passage was narrow, approximately 8 inches square, wide enough to allow smoke to escape but small enough to maintain draft. He lined the interior with his flattest stones, creating smooth surfaces that would encourage upward flow rather than creating turbulence. The chimney extended 6 feet above the roofline. He planned for the cabin, ensuring adequate draw regardless of wind conditions. Building the chimney required temporary scaffolding, wooden supports that held each course in place until the mortar set. Axel worked carefully, knowing that a collapsed chimney would destroy weeks of effort and potentially damage the fire chamber below. Each stone was selected for size and shape, test-fitted, mortared, and secured before moving to the next course. By late October, the chimney was complete, and the mortar had cured sufficiently to remove the scaffolding. He built a simple log cabin around the heat box, using standard construction methods for the walls, roof, and door. The cabin took him 1 week, a stark contrast to the 3 months he had invested in the stone structure. But the cabin was merely shelter from wind and rain. The heat box was survival technology. He positioned the cabin so the stone structure occupied one corner, with the fire chamber opening facing into the interior living space. On November 2, 1834, Axel built his first fire inside the completed chamber. He started with kindling and small sticks, leaving the metal doors fully open. The fire caught easily. Smoke rose through the chimney without backing up into the cabin. He gradually added larger pieces of wood, watching how the fire behaved. The stone walls around the fire began warming noticeably within an hour. After the fire had burned steadily for 2 hours, Axel began closing the metal doors incrementally. He closed them halfway, watching carefully. The fire continued burning normally, fed by air flowing through the gap between the doors and around their edges. He closed them further, leaving only a 2-inch gap. The flames diminished slightly, but remained vigorous. The draft through the chimney was pulling air through the narrow opening, feeding the fire adequately. He closed the doors completely. For several minutes, nothing changed. Then he noticed the flames beginning to dim, but they did not extinguish. Instead, they settled into a steady, lower burn, sustained by the small amount of air leaking around the door edges and being pulled through by the chimney draft. He watched for 20 minutes. The fire continued burning in this reduced state, consuming wood much more slowly than when the doors were open. Axel opened the doors. The fire immediately brightened, flames leaping higher as more air became available. He closed them again. The fire returned to its slower, hidden burn. He had succeeded. The fire could be sealed and would continue burning without suffocation. The concept that Fergus and others had insisted was impossible was functioning exactly as Axel had envisioned. Axel spent the next week testing his heat box systematically. He learned that the optimal approach was to build a substantial fire with the doors open for 2 to 3 hours, allowing the stone mass to absorb maximum heat. Then he could close the doors partially or completely, depending on how much ongoing heat he wanted. With doors fully closed, the fire would burn slowly for 6 to 8 hours on a single loading of wood. The stone walls radiated warmth continuously, maintaining comfortable cabin temperature even as the visible audience Flames diminished to glowing coals. The cooking capability exceeded his expectations. With the doors open, he could hang pots from the chain system and cook over direct flames like a normal fire. But the real innovation came from using the chamber as an oven. He would build a hot fire, let it burn down to coals, then place food on a flat stone inside the chamber and close the doors. The trapped heat cooked bread, roasted meat, and baked vegetables with even temperature that open-fire cooking could never achieve. The enclosed space eliminated the problem of one side burning while the other remained raw. December brought severe cold. Other trappers in the region struggled with the constant demands of open hearth fires. Axel loaded his heat box twice daily, morning and evening. Each firing maintained heat for 12 to 14 hours. At night, he would seal the chamber before sleeping. Morning arrived with the cabin still warm and coals still glowing inside when he opened the metal doors. The difference between his comfort and what he knew others were experiencing was profound. Word had spread through the scattered trapping community about Bergstrom's stone structure. Most reports were secondhand and skeptical. Some claimed he had wasted an entire season building something that could not possibly work. Others suggested he had lost his mind after his partner's death. A few were curious enough to visit and see for themselves. Wilhelm Schneider arrived during a blizzard in mid-December. He was a German trapper working territory 15 miles south of Axel's camp. The storm had caught him between locations, and he sought shelter. When he entered Axel's cabin, he was immediately surprised by the warmth. He looked around for the fire and saw none. The metal doors were closed. There was no visible flame anywhere in the cabin. "Where is your fire?" Wilhelm asked, confused. Axel walked to the heat box and placed his hand on the stone surface. "Here," he said simply. He opened the metal doors. Inside, a bed of glowing coals radiated intense heat. Wilhelm stared at the hidden fire, trying to understand what he was seeing. Axel explained the system while Wilhelm examined the construction. The thick stone walls, the sealed chamber, the controlled draft, the thermal mass principle that allowed heat storage for extended periods. Wilhelm stayed 2 days while the storm passed. He watched Axel load the chamber once each day and observed how the sealed heat box maintained warmth continuously. When he left, he asked detailed questions about construction methods, stone selection, and mortar composition. January 1835 brought the coldest temperatures Axel had experienced in 7 winters. For 5 consecutive days, the thermometer he kept outside registered below zero even at midday. Wind drove the cold deeper, making any exposure dangerous within minutes. Trappers throughout the region abandoned their trap lines and focused entirely on survival. Keeping fires burning became the sole occupation. Wood consumption increased dramatically as men fought to maintain livable temperatures inside poorly insulated cabins. Fergus O'Malley nearly died during this cold spell. He had left his cabin to check a trap line close to camp, expecting to return within 2 hours. While he was gone, his open hearth fire burned through its fuel and died. He returned to a cabin already dropping toward the outside temperature. His hands were too numb to work effectively with flint and steel. His kindling supply was outside. By the time he finally got a fire restarted, he was shaking violently from hypothermia and had lost feeling in 3 toes. He made his way to Wilhelm Schneider's cabin the next day, struggling through deep snow. Wilhelm provided warmth and food while Fergus recovered. After 2 days, Wilhelm brought him to Axel's camp. Fergus entered the warm cabin and saw the sealed metal doors with no visible fire. Axel opened them briefly to show the glowing coals inside, then closed them again. The radiant heat from the stone walls maintained comfortable temperature throughout the space. Fergus sat in silence for a long time, absorbing the reality of what Axel had built. Finally, he spoke. "I called you mad," he said quietly. "I told others you were wasting your time. I was wrong." Axel nodded, but offered no judgment. Fergus had survived, and that was what mattered. Before leaving, Fergus asked if Axel would help him build a similar structure. Axel agreed. Spring of 1835 saw Wilhelm begin construction of his own heat box. He worked through summer and into early fall, gathering stones, fitting them carefully, building the thick walls that would store heat through winter. His structure was complete by October. Other trappers who visited his camp saw the sealed stone chamber and asked questions. Some remained skeptical. Others began their own construction projects. By 1842, approximately 15 trappers in the northern Rockies had built variations of what the community called Bergstrom boxes, or hidden fire systems. The technique spread slowly, carried by word of mouth and direct observation. No one promoted it formally. Those who understood its value built their own. Those who remained skeptical continued with traditional methods. Axel left the mountains in 1843. The fur trade was collapsing, beaver populations depleted, demand fallen. He took his savings to Oregon Territory and established a small ranch. He married Solveig, a Norwegian immigrant, in 1846. They raised 3 children who never knew their father had been a mountain man. Axel Bergstrom died in 1869 at age 66. He was buried in an unmarked grave outside Salem. But throughout the Rocky Mountains, stone heat boxes remained standing, weathered but functional, sheltering new generations of inhabitants, silent testament to innovation born from tragedy, spread through demonstration rather than promotion, and built to outlast the man who conceived it.